The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, written by Mark Twain. Presentation by Randy Newsom and Ariel Fussner. Mark Twain was born on November 30th, 1835 in Florida, Missouri as Samuel Clemens. Later, he moved to Hannibal, Missouri, near the riverbanks of the Mississippi River. Hannibal influenced many of his stories, especially the towns along the river in Huckleberry Finn. He was often kept indoors until he was 9 years old, which led us to believe many of his stories reflected his childhood fantasies he never could play out. As a child, it was common for Clemens to see the violence and death. For example, at 10 years old, he saw a slave die from being beaten with an iron, and his father died when Samuel Clemens was 12 of illness. Clemens became a river pilot apprentice where he earned the name of Mark Twain. Mark Twain means it's safe to navigate along the river. With him being a river pilot, he knew the surroundings and the troubles along the river and added them to Huck.
For historical influence, Huck Finn takes place before the Civil War, which was pro-slavery. Twain's reason for writing Huck Finn was to reach out to readers to see how slavery ideology changed people by changing Huck's point of view as going farther into his journey with Jim. The book exposes the hypocrisy of the South and racism. Twain based the values of society in his town of Hannibal, portraying the South as violent and corrupt. Jim Crow laws at this time were established and slavery had ended, but racism was still there. Jim was soon to be sold off for money, showing slavery truly never ended. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was in effect at this time. This allowed people to claim runaway slaves, which was what Jim was considered as. During their journey, Jim and Huck run into men who are looking for runaway slaves, but Jim is able to pass along and not get caught.
The story begins as Huck Finn, the narrator, is being taken care of by two sisters, Miss Watson and Widow Douglas. One day, his father came into town and says that he is able to take care of him. Pap, Huck's dad, had left Huck alone to survive on his own while he drank. Huck then decides that he was going to run away from his father. A few days later, Huck goes down the river escaping from his father's home. He reaches an island where Jim, Miss Watson's slave, who has also ran away because of his owner, is going to sell him off. At the time, Huck believed Jim was lower than him because of his race, but later changes his mind as they both build a friendship. On their trip down the river, they face many dangerous tasks. First, they come across a couple of robbers on a wrecked steamboat. Later, a thick patch of fog comes across, and they miss their exit to go down the Ohio River to reach the north. Instead, they head towards the south. They come across a couple of men who are looking for runaway slaves, but Jim is able to escape from being caught. The next night, however, Huck and Jim are separated by a steamboat accident, but soon are able to find each other. A few days later, they meet two men who say they are the King of England and the Duke. These men both cause trouble for Huck and Jim by selling Jim off to a local farmer. Huck is also able to find where Jim is at, realizing that the people who took Jim were Silas and Sally Phelps, Tom Sawyer's aunt and uncle. They mistake Huck for Tom, and he goes along with the mistake to get closer to Jim. Huck then finds Tom to tell him of his relatives. Tom agrees to help Huck rescue Jim and act as Tom's younger brother. Tom sets Jim free, and during the escape, Tom is shot. Jim sacrifices himself of being caught to help him. Later, Tom tells Jim that he has been free because Miss Watson has passed away. Huck, though, still afraid of going back to his father. That's when Jim tells Huck his father was the man in the river, and Huck, too, was now free.
Characters. Huck Finn, the protagonist, had run away from his father down the river one day to escape the violence. He was a smart boy who knew how to survive on his own. He meets Jim, his old neighbor's African-American slave, on his escape. Before getting to know Jim, Huck was influenced by society, believing that slavery wasn't bad. Once getting to know Jim, he changes his thoughts on slaves and Jim himself. He thinks that they are just like whites and feels they should not be mistreated, even though this idea goes against society. Huck grows as a person while his relationship with Jim becomes stronger. When Jim is sold to a farmer, Huck goes to look for Jim and gets mistaken as Tom Sawyer. He goes along and is able to free Jim. Later, Jim tells Huck that he has nothing to be afraid of anymore because his father was dead. Jim is an African-American man who was a slave to Miss Watson. He had run away from her because he had heard that Miss Watson was going to sell him, even though she had promised him that she wouldn't. Huck and Jim meet on an island that they both had escaped to. They both get to know one another and build a closer relationship. Jim changes Huck's mind by showing him that African Americans are the same as any other person. When reaching Silas and Sally's home and meeting Tom, Jim is unaware that Miss Watson is dead and he is now a free man. Tom Sawyer. Before Huck's escape, Tom and Huck were good friends. When Huck returns, he meets Tom down by his aunt and uncle's home. Huck tells Tom that his relatives have mistaken him for Tom. Tom goes along with the mistake and says that he would act as if he were his younger brother Sid. Huck then tells Tom about trying to free Jim, and Tom agrees to help. They help Jim escape, but as they all tried to escape, Tom is shot in the leg. Later, Tom tells Jim he is a free man now because 2 months before, Miss Watson had died. Pap is Huck's father, who has been in and out of Huck's life. Pap is very rude to Huck by leaving him by himself and having Huck survive on his own. Later, he forces Huck to live with him even though he is an abusive drunk and Huck was better off living with the widow. When Huck goes missing, Pap believes Huck was murdered, but was more interested in getting Huck's money. Judge Thatcher was the local judge in St. Petersburg who looked out for Huck. Huck gives the money him and Tom had found to the judge in order for his father to not get his money. Widow Douglas and Miss Watson are sisters. Douglas takes care of Huck and feels that it was important for Huck to be educated and to know his facts to use later in life. Miss Watson was a strict woman and Jim's owner who had gone against her word and was going to sell Jim. The Duke and the King were poor con men who had met Jim and Huck along the river. They both had lied to them and tried to take advantage of both Jim and Huck. They joined Huck and Jim on their travel, forcing them to cooperate with their scams. Traveling down the river, the King and Duke caused trouble scamming towns out of their money, and in the end, they deceived Jim and Huck by selling Jim to get enough money for alcohol.
As for setting, Twain sets up the setting as a parallel to his town Hannibal and the people's idea on slavery. Huck and Jim travel to Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi, which are all southern states which caused struggles for the two because of race. Missouri was considered a frontier state during the time of the book, therefore more exploration, like Huck, was more common. The Mississippi River was a major part of transportation. Huck and Jim go along the river going farther south. During this time period, the rich and the poor used the river to seek adventure. Some slaves, like Jim, used the river to seek freedom and to escape from their challenges they faced.
Foster. Quest. Huck escapes from his father to get away from the abusiveness. He takes the canoe down to an island where he meets Jim. Jim had escaped to get away from being sold to someone else to be their slave. They decided to go north to have Jim become a free man, but in the end, they ended up in the south. But Jim was still considered a free man. Along this quest down the river, Huck and Jim establish a relationship that goes against society. Huck shows the reader that the color of one's skin does not matter, but the person inside of them does. Religion. Miss Watson and Widow Douglas talked to Huck about religion very often. Widow Douglas talked about the good in God and how he helps spiritually through rough times. As for Miss Watson, she believes God is not as good as Douglas thinks. With this being said, Huck does not care much for religion or God, but if he had to choose which God was true, he said he would have chosen Widow Douglas's God. But he felt that he would never be taken by God when he dies because of the bad he has done through his boyhood. Huck also believes he will go to hell because of this past and for his internal conflict of deciding whether or not Jim should be free. And he believes Tom Sawyer would go with him and he was happy about that because they would be together. Christ figure. We viewed Jim as a Christ figure. Jim serves others throughout the story. He was always kind and put others before him. On his travel with Huck, he led Huck through the fog and was there whenever Huck would try to escape from the towns along the riverside. While Jim was helping others, he was discriminated for his race. All in all, Jim sacrificed himself for others like Jesus did, but was also discriminated against for doing so. Vampires. The Duke and the King were viewed as vampires. They would constantly steal people's money or set up scams to get what they wanted. At one point, they tried to steal $6,000 from 3 orphan girls while acting like they were their long-lost uncles. They take advantage of others for their personal desires.
The use of Shakespeare was very common in the book. When Huck and Finn come to Bricksfield, the Duke and the King set up a play to recite Romeo and Juliet as well as Hamlet. The Duke and the King are terrible at reciting plays, but their motive was only to rob people of their money by doing the play. As for violence, Huck had an abusive father who he is able to escape from. Pap was a drunk and took his anger out on Huck while he was drunk. The Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons had hatred towards one another and gotten into a dispute for unknown reason, and many people had died in the families. With weather, a fog comes about while Huck and Jim are in the river. They are separated from one another, having to be on their own. The frog represents a white society trying to keep Huck and Jim apart from each other, while it is against society's thoughts of slaves and whites being together. But Huck and Jim are able to come about and escape from it and be together. The social class was very significant in Huck Finn. Jim was considered the lowest part of society, being less than an animal. At the beginning, because of Jim's race and social class, Huck is not fond of him, but as their journey together progresses, they build a relationship, and Huck is able to realize it does not matter the color of someone's skin, but who they are inside, which was what Twain was trying to get across as his theme.
Symbols. The Mississippi River is the main symbol in the book. It reflects Huck's changing personality and maturity. Huck was originally ignorant to the cruelty of slavery, but on his travel with Jim, he became aware of how awful slavery really is. At first, Huck viewed Jim as a joke, but soon learned that Jim is more than property, but is his friend. As for Jim, the river represented freedom. Jim had been a former slave, but escaped to the river to travel to the free states. The river also represented freedom for Huck. Huck had lived with the strict widow until his abusive father forced Huck to live with him. Huck could no longer handle his father's brutality, so he escaped to the Mississippi River. The river can also be seen as a safe haven for Jim and Huck. Every town the two run into, there was violence and absurdity. However, when they reach their raft on the river again, they can finally relax and travel towards freedom. Baptism. Huck plans to escape from his father by going down the river. When doing so, he is taken over by water and is able to be set free from Pap. Once leaving from his guardianship, Huck leaves everything behind. He has started a new life along the Mississippi River and living his journey with Jim. Geography. The story takes place in St. Petersburg, Missouri, which was along the Mississippi River. At the time, Missouri was considered a frontier state and believed slavery was good. The Mississippi River at the time was used as transportation like Huck and Jim used it as.
We had came across 3 themes in the book. Lying was one of them. Lying is a recurring theme throughout the book. Huck lies several times to the travelers, the same as Jim's life. However, the Duke and the King are frauds, and they lie constantly to deceive people of their money. Lying is not good, but Huck's lies are less severe because he is trying to help someone in need. Freedom was the next one that we had come across. If you do not get anything out of Huck Finn, please understand that this book is about retaining freedom. At this time, slaves were beginning to vote, get jobs, and live on their own. Jim had escaped from being a slave to travel to free states, while Huck had escaped from his abusive father to experience adventure. Black or white, the story revolves around obtaining freedom. Racism was the final theme that had come about. Racism is another idea to the main story. African Americans were finally able to have rights and become citizens. In the beginning, Huck's father talks about how he was going to vote, but he saw a civilized African American voting. Huck's father refused to vote, realizing that property could vote. Throughout the story, Huck struggles to accepting Jim as a friend or property. He knows that Jim is excited about being free, but Huck feels it's wrong keeping Jim from his owner. At the time, African Americans were viewed as property, not humans.
Voice elements. Diction. The author uses improper language to portray realism. His purposely misspelled words and used slang terms to show lack of education. Several times the characters would use the word learned instead of taught. The language of the time was extremely different from what it is now. However, the language gives a true feeling of how people lived at that time. Imagery. The writer really focuses on the relationships and the emotions of the characters throughout the book. Huck explains every step of his adventure, the people, the weather, and the scenery. The relationship between Huck and Jim grows as the story goes on. The relationship is very relatable to everyday life, for we experience everlasting relationships as we get older. Syntax. For syntax, it is very similar to diction by the way it is structured. It is very improper and difficult to read at times. It gives a real feel for the time period and portrays how the characters were uneducated. You can tell when Jim talks, the syntax is much more out of order than when Huck talks. If this were to be portrayed in today's sentence structure, the writing style would be much more formal. But by having this done, the culture that is put into the novel by the language would be lost. Tone. There are different tones throughout the novel. The main tone was the sense of urgency. The entire book, Huck is trying to escape his old town while keeping his new friend Jim safe. The intensity of trying to not get caught and escape to freedom is primitive throughout the story. There are also several pickles that they get caught in on their travel that add to the mood of the story.
There were 4 literary devices that we came across: onomatopoeia, sarcasm, simile and metaphors, and foreshadowing. Onomatopoeia was the first one. Throughout the story, Mark Twain uses noises to portray the real effect of what's actually happening. Most of the time along the river, the sounds were plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk. The second literary device was sarcasm. In the beginning, Huck's father is talking about the government and how freed slaves are receiving rights. He disagrees with the idea and he says, "Oh yes, this is a wonderful government, wonderful." He used the saying of the government is great when he truly thinks it's awful. The next literary device is simile and metaphors. Many of the times in the story, similes and metaphors are used to depict true pictures of Huck's adventure. When he meets a beautiful young lady, he usually compares her to something else that is considered beautiful. When he visited the circus, he can describe the circus woman by saying, "And she is looking like the most loveliest parcel," on page 111. Foreshadowing was the last device and was one of the most important throughout the novel. On the night that Huck's father returned to St. Petersburg, Huck goes to Jim to talk to him on what may happen with Pat while he's in town. Jim talks to the hairball, which he believes in superstitions. He talks to the ball and tells that Pap is in great danger of dying in water. Later, while Huck is on Jackson Island, he finds a man shot dead floating in the water. Huck does not know who he is, but he wonders about it on his journey. At the end, Jim tells Huck that the man in the water was him. Jim's superstition in a way came true like a fortune teller. Jim was able to tell the future about Jim's father, and now Huck was free.